So what I'm talking about in this presentation, I know that the title kind of sounds like it's grass banking. We're not talking about grass banking. We're talking about using last year's dry feed. In my area, we have no germination this year, so on this presentation, it's not like irrigated pasture where you're holding it till fall or something like that. We're talking about using last year's feed this year since we have no germination, and what is that feed actually worth? In our case, we're actually having to try to figure out rations, and the annual range part, the dry feed from last year, is part of that base. It may be a small part of that for the feed that we're bringing in, but what I'm trying to attempt to do is give you a little bit of an idea in a 10-minute overview of what that's actually worth right now for figuring out what your rations are. So the first example I'll give here is in protein. If you look at the stage of maturity, you can see early vegetative. That's what we should have been in the fall that we didn't have this year, all the way up through dry leached, which is the dry feed that's been rained on. That's what we actually have right now. So we're looking at that dry feed, and you can see that the protein level on the grasses themselves are down around 3%, 5% for fillery if you can actually find some to lick up. And then this has burr clover at 17%, but remember that for the sake of this presentation, alfalfa wheat was pretty much wiped out most of our burr clover, but the rose clover and vetch are very similar in quality, so you can link them pretty interchangeably. One thing to point out, why do we usually, even though we don't have much feed in the fall, maybe a little bit of fillery started, why don't we have to feed protein supplement? If you look at early vegetative and fillery, it's at 27% crude protein. They only need 5 to 7 pounds of it to match the protein needs. So it doesn't take a whole lot of fillery with high quality it is to actually limp them through, unless you're a year like this where you can't even have that. So to get an idea, comparing the grasses versus the clover on what's there, what they have to be, how much they have to be able to eat. And I bring this up because every place is different in what your balance is grass versus clover left over. So if you can get an idea of what that balance is and what they have on offer, then you can start to kind of try to get an idea of what it's worth out there. So figuring the difference in protein at 3 and 17%. And remember, I'm taking a small cow, so and it works for this for looking up the numbers and for easier math. This is based off a 1,000-pound cow. The dry cow in the middle of gestation is going to need 1.3 pounds of protein a day that they actually have to eat. The cow at calving, and I put that up because a lot of spring calvers may be in that stage here and not too long, is going to need 2.5 pounds of protein a day. So if they were eating clover at that 17% protein, they need somewhere between 7 and 14 pounds of that clover a day to be able to meet that protein requirement. But if we're looking at the grass, take a look at that. The dry cow alone is going to need 44 pounds compared to the calving cow that's going to need 83 pounds. That's double, even with the dry cow, that's double what she can actually take in. So the grass alone is not going to meet the protein needs. That really shows the importance of having that legume base. I threw this slide up because the number one thing that folks look at to start with on drought management is early weaning. And this slide I got from Larry. We were talking about this actually last spring when we were watering some plots, and he sent me the slide, so I totally credit him for getting it. And what this chart shows you is that this white part down here is the pounds of TDN go up on this. So this is the pounds. We're actually looking at energy now. The white part here is actually what she needs just for regular body maintenance. This part in here is what she needs to be able to walk around and graze. This part here is what she needs to actually manage for lactation. So where's the value in early weaning? Look at this spike right here, all the way up to 12 for the cow that's calved instantly, what her added requirements are. So the take-home message is, if you got fall calves, be thinking about weaning them for saving those energy costs right now, particularly with how this year's looking. It's time to really be on that bandwagon. So breaking it down in energy a step further, we have the percent TDN on the grass, fillery, and clover. Notice with this, TDN-wise, they're not as hugely different as they are in protein. The dry cow in the middle of gestation is going to need 8.8 pounds of TDN, so an energy value. The calving cow is going to need 13.8. So looking at it again, if we're looking at it on a clover basis, that'd be 13 pounds of clover to be able to meet that, 13 to 21, or 15 to 24 pounds of grass, which figuring, remember when we mentioned this is the pounds of TDN, it is not their dry matter intake requirement. That is higher. But saying that that dry matter intake is over 20 pounds for even a 1,000-pound cow, it sounds like this is doable, right? Here's the curveball. We talked about annual grasses. That's not Medusa head with silica. That's not barb goat grass that they're avoiding and all the other kinds of weeds out there. So we have a major curveball in actually making that kind of intake possible. So beyond looking at what the percentage of grass versus clover is, it's what percentage is actually edible and what percentage are they actually getting something out of. Because if you look in here and try to find annual grasses versus the Medusa head that's in there, it's a low component right there. So one thing, I don't have enough time to really dive into calcium and phosphorus. It's a quick overview of protein and energy and what are they worth and trying to figure out your rations. And remember that this stuff is written down in your handout. Calcium is in clover. That's all you need to remember. Calcium is in clover. Phosphorus is generally going to be lacking in this dry feed, but basically any supplement that you give them is going to fill the phosphorus need they have, but calcium's in clover. So if you were going to look at a hierarchy, wheat hay, a lot of, if you were able to find some grain hay from last year, is really low in calcium. Ryegrass hay, it's kind of okay, but if you're really going to fit that, that's where your alfalfa is going to come in. Most of the rations without some kind of alfalfa or something are pretty lacking in calcium. So what are some ideas on what we can do? One thing we can do is change balance on grass versus clover. And one slide that before this drought that would have sounded pretty stupid to people is rose clover. And why are we looking at rose clover? Because the cattle don't eat it when it's green. They lick it up when it's dry. Now I understand some value in rose clover. I kind of like that idea now of being able to save that when it's green. If I've got green feed, they can eat something else. It's when it's dry right now that running through and licking up that clover is a good opportunity to increase the quality. The other beauty part with rose clover is it does preserve its quality pretty well, even later on through the year. It's really palatable. You notice when you get into the fall, they run one of the first things they go through and lick up. It's also one of the few clovers that can survive without applications of phosphorus. It's one of the few clovers that actually makes it without being inoculated as well. But that makes it actually a lot more inexpensive compared to, say, a subclover seeding where you're going to have to put the phosphorus to it or something like that. The seed is one of the cheapest seeds as far as price per pound. Rate is really low. 1 or 2 pounds an acre is probably enough to get it done, and it's always available. It's not one of those that we have to get from Australia where you can't get it next year if it works great this year. One thing on inoculation for it, most of the clover seed, the rose clover that I see around is not inoculated. So it's not fixing nitrogen. So even if you have some out there, it might be worth putting a little in just to get that is pre-inoculated. You can buy Pelcoat inoculated that comes pre-inoculated, so you actually don't have to mix it anymore. To get the nitrogen response, if we ever did have rain and there was grass around, it needs to be inoculated or it won't fix nodules at all. Vetch, another idea. I would say with vetch, if you don't see some where you're at now, you're probably not a candidate to put it in. It does pretty well, but kind of the same idea. I threw it up because it's the same idea. Not as palatable when it's green, very palatable when it's dry. Vetch fixes almost the most nitrogen of any of the legumes. So on planting this stuff, I don't care how you plant it as long as you get the inoculant in the ground. That can be plant it today and we have an inch of rain tonight. That can be and broadcast it out and get an inch of rain to wash that inoculum into the ground. That can be run over it with a tractor harrow. A drill's probably a pretty expensive way to go, but in general, this is one of the easiest seeds to get started. Has enough hard seed that if it doesn't take this year, it will next year. Just get the inoculum in the ground and keep it simple. The other idea, we talked about the weed problem, the grasses that aren't so good. What about sticking some in the ground that are good? The annual grasses that you can plant, the soft chesses, the ryegrass types. Soft chest is a little bit expensive, has a little better ability to stick around than ryegrass. Usually the year you plant ryegrass, it's a home run and trickles off from there. So the investment-wise, it's tough depending on where you're at on seeing whether that works. So that's definitely a local contact on what an annual grass base might be. Soft chest can be a little expensive. It can be $250 to $280 a pound. So that takes some economic penciling to see if that works out for you. Glenn mentioned that I'd mentioned the perennials. I threw a picture up here of Fletcher fescue. I would call this an option for a moderate drought year. This year is actually so bad that I don't think they save you because you'd have to worry about grazing them and killing them. Where they work is a year like last year or previous years where we get 1 or 2 big rains and then it doesn't rain for a long time. They have the ability to take up deep moisture. On a year like this where there's no soil moisture at all, I don't know if they're a lifesaver. So they're still growing. There's far more growth to them there, but whether it's usable is kind of questionable. But maybe for the moderate drought year on some of the better ground, definitely could be an option. Other ideas, Glenn mentioned first, remember, don't wreck your feed for next year. Those RDM guidelines protect the grass from being able to go and have a combination of grasses versus clovers or legumes and forbs in general. Remember on that your degradation of what you leave this spring is you're going to lose about 7 to 13% of it a month going through the year. So remember it as you manage through that when you look at these guidelines. And I would encourage you, I didn't have enough time to put up a full slide on RDM guidelines. If you Google residual dry matter management and UC, you'll get there's a copy much like the handout that Larry was talking about on annual rangeland quality. That gives you a good idea of what kind of the amount of dry feed that you need to protect not only the soil but also your chances of having some grass next year. So I think that wrecks my 10 minutes of trying to go through nutrition.
We have time for 1 or 2 questions for Josh.
These clovers and stuff you're talking about, how do they do in the higher desert country where it freezes all winter?
Can you repeat the question, Josh?
The question is, how do the clovers that I mentioned, rose clover and vetch, do in the high desert country where it's froze over through the winter? And these are not the same option for that. These would be based for down here in the valley for this winter drought. There's Montefiore and stuff with limited success up there, but not enough to do a base recommendation for the high desert.
Thank you.
Josh, what's the crude protein for rose clover? You didn't give that here, or if you did, I didn't see it. I
would read the bird clover quality percentages and just go right off of that. It's going to be so similar that if you ran a trial and you had the 2 of them next to each other, they wouldn't be statistically different.